Thank you again for collaborating and sharing Torah with as many people as possible. And as always, we try to bring the Parsha to life and some direct experience that we can take from the Parsha itself. And I thought that today we do a little extra and bring a little bit of Adar or Purim, and I'll do it the way I will, and Reuben will follow and do the same. And then, of course, we open up the questions and answers afterwards. So this week's Torah, we're going to jump right in if that's okay. This week's Torah portion is Parshat Mishpatim. Mishpatim is the word that describes one of the particular mitzvahs. There are three kinds of mitzvahs. Mishpatim means judgment and law, and this parsha deals with a lot of specificness of damages. If someone damages, deals with slavery, a lot of details, almost boring, and almost very little that we can directly connect with, as I'll share with you soon. But what there seemed to be a little bit of a downer. Last week we had Yisro and we got the Ten Commandments. That's pretty powerful stuff. And all of a sudden we come to the I'm Lord your God, God, very, very big, infinite Hashem, becoming partnerships and making this world a better for tooth, kind of, descends from that great moment. So what's going on over here? So first of all, Mishpatim means judgment. There's three types of mitzvahs. Chukim, Edus, and Mishpat. Chukim are the type of mitzvahs that have no reasoning behind it. It's called a chuk. And Edus is a type of mitzvah which, once the Torah tells us why we do it, we understand it. Like, for example, since God rests on the seventh day, we keep Shabbos and we rest on the seventh day. So we can understand that. And then, of course, Mishpat is basically things that are obvious. Don't kill, don't steal. But still, we have to have this in place. And the short reason to give you the answer, not we're going to talk about this, but just to give the quick answer to the question of why do we have Mishpatim, followed right by, the Aseret HaDibros, and Rashi addresses this and says, just as those were given by Sinai, this is also given by Sinai. Or it's even the basic things that you think is totally comprehensible from your own understanding, we should appreciate it as if it's the word of Hashem. It has a much more significance. It's not that we don't kill, we don't steal, because I understand that's not a good thing to do. Because you can find countries, perhaps, that they have lax, maybe even inner cities in our own country, that their laws are lax on this. So that can't be the reason why we don't. But it has to be of a higher purpose, a higher understanding. Now, I want to talk about a unique discussion that takes place based on our parsha, and of course, the Mishnah, if I can quote it over here. The Mishnah in Besetta's Baba Kama talks about it. There are four, what we call father archetype of damages, Arba Avos Nezikin, which come from this week's parsha as well, and we talk about different damages. So the Gemara, the Mishnah talks about it based on the verses in Shemot, which is chapter 21 and verses 18. It goes on through quite a few verses. And I want to share this with you so it's a takeaway we can bring into our own experience and not just feel, wait a second, the Beis HaMikdash, these laws, how does it connect to me? How's it talking to me? Torah is Melashon Hara'ah. If I can't figure out how Torah is talking to me in my life, then I'm missing it. So we're not just repeating words like zombies. We have to inculcate it into our own experience. So it says there's four types of nizikin damages. One is called hashar, which literally means an ox, vahabar, and a pit. Vahamava is a machlokas, but we're going to go with the one that says that it means man, a human being. Vahabe'er, and it means already a fire. And so these are the four archetypes. They each have a different experience of their little. A shar, for example, if you have an ox and it gores once and it gores twice and it gores three times, okay, it has to be responsible for this particular ox. It knows that it likes to damage. It has to have bigger fences. Maybe it has the leash, I'm not sure, but it has to be more responsible for it. And same thing with the shar, if you had a pit, or if you made a pit and someone fell into it. So it's explained that these four different categories truly represent four different really experiences of our own ability to damage, of the human experience to damage. And we compare these four to psychological experiences that every human being goes through. For example, the first part, in terms of when we see it in terms of an animal, we know for those who've been to our class a few times, the Alter Rebbe goes at great length and talks about the nefesh habahamis. We have each have an animal soul. That animal soul is instinctive to survive. That's its nature. And just as an animal who's looking to survive will damage something in order to survive, sometimes we take on that expression also. We don't need to, because we also have a nefesh elokis. We have a higher appreciation and purpose. But sometimes the animal side of us gets the better of us, and we act instinctively versus rationally versus morally. So that's something that we must be careful about. In addition to the animal default position, we also have the pit. The pit represents the part of us that can sometimes feel empty. And because of that emptiness, that allows us to go into a certain level of, creates paralysis and sometimes even depression, my worthiness, self-loathing. We know this is a big topic in today's conversation. Certainly during pandemic, I get plenty of calls from the young adult space. People are alone and they ask themselves, what is their self-worth? This is reflective of the pit that we can each all have a certain experience, and we have to be careful about. Now, in many ways, well, let me continue and then we'll come back to it. The third one is the human experience. What's the human experience and how could that be damaging? There are many times that because we feel that we are human, because we feel we're someone of intellect, that can be the better of us. How come we see so many people with such great charisma, great skills, great intelligence fall from grace? Whether they make personal mistakes, whether they make communal mistakes, they take advantage of their power. It comes from one place only. They get lost in their own intelligence. They buy their own script, so to speak, and they believe they're infallible. Anyone who touches any element of power and makes that mistake is extremely vulnerable. I remember before I moved to Boston a long time ago, my father warned me, not that I was ever at risk of feeling too great, but in case he said, you make it big out there, he says, Mayshe, just remember one thing. You always have to listen to your wife, who'll remind you of who you really are. He says the whole world's going to tell you you're great, you're great, you're great. You're lucky, Baruch Hashem, you have a wife who loves you and will keep you grounded and tell you who really you are. Why? Because sometimes you can get to your head, you have a big event and this, that, and people say how wonderful you are. You actually can buy into that. It's not that it's not okay to take a compliment, but it depends where we go with it. And we see many times, not to personalize this, where many great leaders, unfortunately, even rabbis, can abuse their position for things that are not proper, not healthy. Why? Because that's the danger of the human experience. We see it with cult leaders, we see it with politicians, although the word politician doesn't have the same meaning it had 30 years ago. So, it's almost like a given when you say the word politician. But I think you know what I'm talking about. So that's the one thing, that's number 3 in terms of the human experience. And of course, the fourth one we have is the idea of a fire. What's fire? Fire is a personal element of, there's something that we say, there's a certain rage. I couldn't help myself. I was forced to, right? Some will say, if anyone who's caved on a diet knows that feeling, right? I couldn't help myself. There was a cupcake left in the kitchen. Nobody was around. I was starving and I had no choice. I had to eat it. A certain fire that takes over. And this idea of fire, I remember as a yeshiva boy in Crown Heights, when sadly there was a shooting, you may remember this, of Ari Halberstam. Now they built the Jewish Children's Museum in his memory, actually, in Kingston Avenue. And he was part of a motorcade that was following the Rebbe when the Rebbe was in the hospital at that time. This must have been 1992, 93. And there was assassination attempt actually against the Rebbe, and the van that followed the Rebbe veered off, and the terrorists went after the van and not after the Rebbe and shot into the van, injuring several and killing Nebuch Rahman al-Islam, a carbon Ari Halberstam. Of course, the defense attorney for I think his name was Rashid Baz, was this Arab terrorist, was of course a nice Jewish guy by the name of William Kunstler, who's already Olav Shalom, famous lawyer. And what was the defense? Rage. He was upset about how Palestinians were being treated, how this was being treated. That was a defense position. Of course, it didn't hold up in court, but I remember even the idea that someone should say rage, as if that can go ahead and qualify anyone's behavior for any reason. So we have to bring it back. We have over here 4 different categories of which our Parsha deals with. And sometimes, obviously, on the Pshat level, is dealing with certain animals that gore, but on another deeper level, it's something that we can take into our own life and our own experience in terms of the things that we need to be careful for, because we are also capable of this sort of damage. So as a refresher, the first one is the animal instinct that we have in ourselves. We also have the one to be the pit, which represents this level of passivity or self-loathing. And of course, we have the human being, not to get ahead of ourselves intellectually and think that we are the top. And of course, the fire, which is more the instinctive rage that sometimes takes us over. There's a lot more to be said on this, but I wanted to add one more teaching in the Parsha, and I think it's better that we bring into another teaching, and then maybe we'll come back to this after during Q&A. This is a classic. I'm sure Reuven is familiar with this one, which we also have in this week's portion, and I think it's important that we all learn this very, very special Torah. And the reason why I'm sharing this with everybody today is because in addition to the teaching of the Torah, it happens to be re-quoted in a book called Hayom Yom. And the Hayom Yom happens to be today, the 28th of Shvat. 28th, for those who don't know, is Koach. Koach means power. And in today's Hayom Yom, we have this beautiful teaching from the Holy Baal Shem Tov. What does he say? You could take a look in the... I'm going to try to do this. Let's see if I get fancy. Can you see that shared screen? Hang on a second. Can you see it?
Yep.
Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. So great. So what we have here is chapter 24. This is in today's Torah portion. And we have Pasuk 5. I'm going to read you the verse and its pshat level, and then we're going to go into its deeper meaning. And then you could see how when we look at the Torah, we should see it not just on its pshat level, but also on its remez, drush, and sod, and how it relates to our own personal life. So check this out. Kisira chamar sainecha. You see the donkey of your enemy. Roivetz tachas masay is burdened under its burden or its load. V'chadalte me azav loy, and you considering to refraining from helping him. Azav tazav imay. You should certainly help him. That's the verse. That's a literal translation. A lot of questions on this. How does the Torah know what's in the mind of the person walking by his enemies? And why does it have to repeat it? Why did it say, if you see your enemy, you should help him? No, it has to go into the psychological reading of the person that maybe in your mind, you were thinking about helping and not helping him. You should certainly help him. It's an interesting language. Baal Shem Tov takes us into a whole different experience. He says, Kisira chamar seinecha. Chamar comes from the word earthiness. Your body is representative of your chomer. So when you see your own chamar that's being burdened, seinecha, by your enemy, it doesn't like the fact that, why does it hate the body? Because it doesn't like that there's a part inside you that wants to connect to something higher. The disposition of every single Jewish soul is that it wants to connect to its creator. That's the way it's hardwired. There's not a lot we can do about that. We can just suppress it, we can ignore it, but at some point everybody's going to have to deal with this idea of this voice, internal voice that wants to connect to something deeper. And for that very reason alone, the body, the instinctive body, the animal body, which we spoke about in the first part of the class, is constantly pushing this soul and suppressing it. It's on top of it. It becomes a burden. So it says, Roivetz tachas masa, it's under this burden. And God intended that the body be refined. And over here, you have too much on the burden of this Torah, of this yoke, is too much on it. So a person can very easily say, you know what? Let me forget about it. Let me recoil. Let me just allow and go through the motions that I'm supposed to do. I'll hit the highlights of my Judaism. You know, tradition, tradition, tradition. My parents did it. I'll do it. Hopefully my kids will do it somewhat. And we move on. And so the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov says, no, don't get stuck with the fact that there seems to be a burden. You have to push back and you have to push forward in terms of ultimately taking off the burden. You should certainly refrain when you think about refraining from helping because it's too difficult to take that challenge on in your life. It says, Azav Tazav Ima, you should certainly move forward and try to lift up. And when we say lift up, what does that mean? It means by removing some of the things that are in the way of allowing this connection that we could have. And for everybody, it's different. Ultimately, I believe in today's time, it's what we call time management. We get too lost up in TikTok. We get too, busy with, now we have Clubhouse, Baruch Hashem, a new social media presence in our world that we have to contend with. Everybody's busy with different things going on in their life, but ultimately they're not allowing this connection. Azev tazav imay. Don't beat yourself up in terms of why this load is on your head. Simply lift yourself up. Lift yourself up. Why? Because to be proud of this connection you have, to embrace the connection you have. Don't think of yourself as Judaism as something that you got to do, but it's something that you get to do, right? And as long as we see it that way, so it's azev taziv imay, you will certainly be able to lift yourself up. And so from this, I'm going to segue into Adar and Purim. We'll take 2 more minutes, and I'm going to pass the mic to Reuven. Tomorrow night is Rosh Chodesh Adar. Adar, we know the highlight of Adar is Purim, but from the whole Adar, it's Marbim B'Simcha. Tomorrow night is Rosh Chodesh, even Nichnas Adar. Before you get to Adar, you already have this idea of bringing in Simcha. What's the greatest way of Simcha? What's the greatest Simcha we can have? What's the greatest joy we can have? Ultimately, the greatest joy we can have, I believe, is our ability to know, to feel completely that we are connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're connected to something greater than ourselves, that we are not alone in this world. We're connected with each other on this class. We're connected to our family members. We're connected to our spouses if we have them. God willing, for those who need them, they should be connected to their spouses and Mirza Hashem soon. Anytime we feel a connection, but we're not feeling isolated, that there's joy in that. That's the idea of joy, is that you're with other people. Now it's a little bit trickier. We have to go on Zoom and this and that and be a little more creative perhaps, but it doesn't take away from the ability or the reality of being connected to something higher. What takes away from joy? Obviously, this sense of being alone, the sense of being distant from our Creator and distant from each other. So what's the whole idea of Purim? What's the whole idea of Adar? What are we trying to obliterate? What does Haman represent? What does Amalek represent? We know Amalek represents Suffolk. It's the Gematria Suffolk also. It means doubt. What's the doubt? The doubt to think, God forbid, for 1 second that you're alone. You can't be alone. How could you possibly be alone? If you have a soul inside you, then you're part of something greater. You're part of God. Comes Amalek, says there. All of you don't actually have a deeper connection. If you were to breathe again, you can learn Torah with each other, see each other. That alone is azev taziv imay. Then you're certainly getting connected. And when you feel connected to something higher, that alone is a reason for simcha. That is alone a reason to lift yourself up, because at this point it's not a burden anymore. So that's the ultimately idea of hopefully connecting a little bit of the parsha, of seeing an insight to the parsha that we can apply to our lives within the month of Adar coming tomorrow night. And it should be the whole Adar. I'll always conclude with a blessing. May we never feel alone. We should always be connected to our higher source, our higher power, our soul. And may it only bring us joy to each and every single one of us. And may this Adar be the ultimate v'nahapachu, not just the pandemic to no pandemic time, everybody. It's not quite what I want it to be. We're warming up, but will suffice for now for the l'chaim. Okay.